So in our last section, we were talking about evidence of evolution. So we've talked about Darwin's theory of natural selection. We've talked about how organisms, the individuals can't change over time, but populations can change. And then we've talked about how that evolution, we know that it happens. We know it's still happening. So how do we study that? And we talked about fossils. We can look at their locations, where they are in the ground. And we can look at comparative geography, where do organisms live. Homologous structures, underlying bone structures that show a common ancestry. And vestigial structures that don't have a function anymore but are almost like a leftover that hasn't disappeared, because remember, a structure doesn't disappear just because you don't use it. So those structures are still there, but they may not have a function anymore. And then we talked about comparative embryology, how embryos developing similarly can show common descent. So taking all of that information, what we can do is we can build, or what we have done, is build an evolutionary tree. And an evolutionary tree is sort of not quite like like what you would see in a pedigree, where it's just sort of one trait through generation. This sort of shows relatedness among organisms. It's usually sideways. Sometimes it'll actually have time frames on it. Like if it's based on fossil evidence, it might actually have times of when they know this fossil existed, and kind of builds this relationship between several different organisms. They use homologous structures, structures organisms have in common, and they can track back, okay, when was the first time that this particular structure appeared? How closely are those structures to one another? How different are they from one another? And they also use molecular structures, which we haven't talked about yet, but we'll talk about in a few minutes. So this is an evolutionary tree, and what I want you to see, you see all the organisms on the right. Every branch on the left is showing where two species diverged from each other. In other words, at point 1, lungfish and everybody else shared a common ancestor. But there was a branch here, and everybody past point 1 has tetrapod limbs, meaning they have legs. So in other words, at some point, legs came about. The lungfish doesn't have legs, so he branches prior to that trait appearing. After that point, we see amphibians and mammals branch off. Actually, not just mammals, everybody else branches off from the amphibians, because everybody past that point has an amnion, which is the special membrane around an embryo. It actually allows organisms to lay eggs on land. Even though mammals don't lay eggs, we still do have an amnion, amniotic fluid, amniotic sac, etc. Here's my point. A lot of people have trouble reading these because they don't understand how to do it properly. They look at the right side and they think that everybody who's next to each other is most closely related. Let me show you, for example. So this question says, are crocodiles more closely related to lizards or to birds? Now, I asked this exact question in class, and most people said lizards. Well, let me show you why that's not correct. So here's crocodiles, here's lizards. People looked at the right side of this tree and they went, oh, well, they're right next to each other. Birds are all the way down here. They're further apart. But that's not how you read the tree. In fact, ostriches and hawks could be switched. It wouldn't change anything, as a matter of fact. It would not change the relationship between them. All that matters is where they branch. So ostriches and hawks branch at position 6. Technically, they could have written ostriches down here and hawks up here. It would not have changed anything. So, to figure out how closely related organisms are, what you want to do is track them back from the organism back to where it diverged from the previous organism. So let's do that with crocodiles and birds. So crocodiles and birds, if I track back to where they meet at position 5, right? Now let's track back and see crocodiles and lizards. So crocodiles and lizards meet all the way back here at position 4, further back in our evolutionary tree, because this is basically getting more primitive as we go backwards. So our correct answer is crocodiles are more closely related to birds. They share a more recent common ancestor here at point 5 than crocodiles and lizards. So don't look here, because these can actually be flip-flopped all over the place. What you want to do is literally track the lines back and see where their most recent common ancestor is. And we'll talk more about this in the next chapter. But we do know that crocodiles are more closely related to birds. It actually makes sense. If you look at a lot of the fossilized dinosaurs, we see dinosaurs if you pluck the feathers off a bird, it actually looks a lot like a dinosaur. It looks a lot like a reptile. They have very similar skin. We see fossils of intermediate species of dinosaurs where there were early feathers. We see early beaks. We see early wings. So we can definitely track that back and show that, that they're more closely related to the birds. Okay, the last one is comparative biochemistry. This is another one of those evolutionary trees down here. This one actually is done vertically, but notice how this one also has time frames on it. So sometimes they'll have that. Again, what we've discovered in this case, using biochemistry, which is actually probably one of our best ways to study evolution now. It's kind of a newer way, and it's taught us so much more because we can learn how much of our DNA is in common, and we can actually track back and find like the first ancestor that had a particular mutation in the DNA, and the more mutations there are, the further the two organisms have diverged from each other. So DNA evidence gives us actually way more information than just looking at homologous structures or even external structures, because just because they look the same on the outside doesn't necessarily mean they're the same on the inside. Remember, there's a lot of things called analogous structures, where organisms happen to develop similar characteristics, but they're not actually related. But their DNA would tell us how closely related they are. So if we look here, we can see that the raccoon and the red panda, based on their DNA, very closely related, diverged about 40 million years ago from the rest of the bears. And then the giant panda. And then notice our most closely related bears, brown bear and polar bear, live in similar habitats. Polar bear's a little further north. Probably mutations, natural selection, some random chance and things like that. And these guys diverged into each other, where polar bears became better adapted for their environment. Brown bears were more adapted to where they lived. But again, this is another one of those evolutionary trees. And so biochemical evidence can really be helpful with straightening out a lot of this stuff. Okay, so Darwin basically, one of the reasons why he suggested natural selection, and we're going to wrap up with this last couple of slides here, is because he knew about artificial selection. So what artificial selection is when people purposely choose particular traits they like, and then they breed organisms to get, those traits. Like I really like the personality of a Labrador retriever, but I really like the fact that poodles don't shed. So I'm going to cross a Labrador and a poodle, and I get a Labradoodle, and this breed has the best of both. It doesn't shed, but it's got, this personality. And we do this, this is something that humans do, and we're not picking based on who's going to survive the best in this case. We're picking based on characteristics we like. So rock pigeons, this is like the common pigeon that you see in the city. But through artificial breeding, we actually have gotten all these crazy looking pigeons, these fancy ones that then people might keep as pets. We do the same thing with parakeets. We do it with dogs. We do it with cats. In farming, they do it with chickens. Pick the chickens that lay the most eggs. Breed those. If it's a genetic trait, we can make chickens that lay more and more and more eggs. We can make cows that produce more milk or better meat. So that's artificial. So anyway, Darwin's point was, if in a really short period of time, we can use artificial breeding and we can create all these crazy traits, then doesn't it make sense that nature could do the same thing? That it might take a little bit longer, but through mutations and natural selection, the environment, instead of people, might choose traits that survive and get passed on, and organisms could change over time. So a lot of his ideas about natural selection were added to because he knew about artificial selection, and then that worked. So to summarize natural selection, variations, you have to have heritable, meaning inherited, genetic variations, not variations made because of your environment. You dye your hair, you cut your finger off, whatever. Those things aren't going to get passed on. But inheritable traits, like your eye color, your height, your skin color, your blood type, certain things about your immune system. If some of those things help you survive better, and there's too many offspring and not everybody's going to live, the idea is that those with the best traits, the best adaptations for the environment will survive, pass those on, and the population will become more and more adapted to the environment. Again, not because the individuals changed, but because the population did. So to summarize some misconceptions and make sure everybody's got this straight. Number one, individuals are selected to survive based on their environment, but individuals don't evolve. Instead, the population is what evolves. Some survive, some don't, and then the population changes in the next generation. Brown bears don't turn tan, but if more brown bears are dying, tan ones reproduce, you get more tan ones. It can only amplify, make it more or less heritable traits, traits that are inherited, and traits that are already there. If nobody has fur and it gets really cold, we're not going to develop the ability to grow fur to survive. But there are people that have hair all over their bodies genetically, way hairier people than other people. If that trait suddenly became a benefit, those people would survive better, and that trait might become more common. And evolution is not goal-directed. We're not like going towards perfection. It's a random process. The environment is selecting organisms that survive. Mutations appear. Some may be good, some may be bad. Some may be completely neutral. The mutation causes you to have violet eyes, but violet eyes don't help or hurt you. So they just kind of hang around. But then the environment changes and suddenly violet eyes are helpful. Well, now that trait might be selected for, even though it wasn't before. So it's not going to produce perfect organisms. And in fact, I've mentioned this before, it's often a compromise. You know, the ability to walk upright, allows us to do some things better, but some things not as good, right? Tigers run way faster than we do, you know, but we can reach things and we can do all kinds of things. So, you know, it really just, it's a compromise. You don't necessarily get the perfect organism. You get organisms that are adapted to their environment based on what can happen. This is just a summary, a really good example. So a lot of people think, misconception, that if I spray a lot of pesticide, I'm going to have organisms that develop resistance. They think that, again, misconception, that the organisms develop resistance in response to the pesticide. Because they were exposed to pesticide, some of them, somehow, their body goes, ooh, I need to live through this, and some of them get lucky, and they create resistance. That's not what happens. Here's what's happening. So you have these organisms, and a few of them are already resistant. They have the ability to survive the pesticide. If not, then it works. The pesticide kills everybody. Perfect. But you may have a few that are resistant. Well, now, if you spray the pesticide, you basically killed off all their competition. Everybody that's not resistant dies. Who's left? Just resistant ones. What's going to happen in the next generation or several generations down the road? Everybody's resistant. The pesticide doesn't work anymore. So we've seen this happen in insects. Lots of insects are completely resistant to all kinds of pesticides. We have to keep coming up with new ones. We've also seen this with antibiotics, overprescribing them. So again, the pesticide doesn't cause the resistance. The resistance was already there, but it becomes more common. All right? And that's it. So natural selection is an editing process. It doesn't create the new things. It determines if they'll survive. It's dependent on time and place. You've got to have the environment that supports it. And that's it.